Good morning. We will now begin the Hybrid Symposium on Caribbean Agriculture, Nourishing Resilience for Sustainable Food Security. This activity is sponsored by our National Institute of Food and Agriculture project of the United States Department of Agriculture at Interamericana University of Barranquitas campus. We acknowledge the presence of Dr. Juana Negrón Berríos, Chancellor of Barranquitas campus of Interamericana University of Puerto Rico, Deans of Academic, Administrative, and Student Affairs of the Barranquitas campus of Interamericana University of Puerto Rico, Dr. Alok Arun, Director of the National Institute of Food and Agriculture project of the United States Department of Agriculture. Invited speakers, Dr. Terry Hens from the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium. Also, Dr. Jim Giovannoni from Cornell University, New York. Dr. Diane Beckles from University of California, Davis. Dr. Emily Merchant from Rutgers University, New Jersey. Dr. Sonia Peters from Biocultural Education and Research, Barbados.
In progress.
Dr. James Sanchez from Corteva Agroscience, Dr. Loren Rodriguez Rivera from Puerto Rico Science, Technology and Research Trust, Dr. David Hensley from University of Virgin Islands. Connected via Zoom, Dr. Shauna Manning from Florida International University, Dr. James Elrich from Stanford University. Dr. Natasha De Leon, President of the American Association from the Advancement of Science Caribbean Division, accompanied by Dr. Elizabeth Davila Santiago. Professors, administrative personnel, and students of the Barranquitas campus and other campuses of the Interamericana University of Puerto Rico. Students and staff of the Bilingual Academy at Inter Barranquitas, our guests from and outside Puerto Rico that accompany us in this moment. We give a warm welcome to you all to this symposium. Thank you for being with us today, I should say. As is a custom in our institution, we would like to invite Mr. Radames Montesino Rios to guide us with a prayer. For those who can stand up, please do so.
Good morning. Almighty God, this morning we praise you for your immense goodness and mercy. Thank you for allowing us to enjoy this new day. We beseech you that your divine grace blesses us. Enlighten with your divine wisdom the resources that will be exposing their knowledge and experiences. May the learning obtained benefit our students and the event participants. Thank you for your company and for your presence in our lives. We have prayed in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
You may be seated. At this moment, I want to invite Dr. Alok Arun, USDA Project Director, to address you with a greeting.
Good morning, everyone. Buenos días. It's my pleasure to welcome you all, especially all the esteemed invited speakers. Today, we are going to discuss a very important topic, that is food security. Let me ask you this question. How many of you like to eat? Raise your hands. Everybody. How many of you like to produce what you eat? Very few. So I hope by the end of this symposium, you will learn something about what is food insecurity and how you can improve the food security for regions like Caribbean island, where we import most of the food. And when you import a lot of food, you also import a lot of illness, sickness, and diseases. So I really hope that you will learn a lot from this symposium, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
thanks Dr. Arun for his greetings. We also want to invite Dr. Juana Negron Berrios, Chancellor of our campus, who will also address you with a greeting.
Good morning. Buenos días to everyone. It's a pleasure to have you in Barranquitas campus, and we are very proud to present this subject on agriculture, food security, and resilience, especially in our Caribbean region. Like Dr. Alok was mentioned, every food that we bring to our home, to our plates every day, comes from agriculture. And it also means that we need, and we have the farmers behind that. We have the people who work in the food chain in each one of these Caribbean regions. The Caribbean is a very nice place to live. I love the Caribbean. And all the countries, all the different islands in the Caribbean, they have their own particular characteristic. We share culture. We share many things in common, good climate. However, we also share food insecurity. So that means that each one of those countries, we must analyze what is happening with our food. Why most of our food comes from outside. We have the talent, we have the land, and especially with the new technologies, we can use different kind of land. Even in Barranquitas, then we have hills. We can use precision agriculture. We can use biotechnology. We can use many tools from the science to improve our agriculture. That's why we choose this subject to be discussed today. Our Institute of Sustainable Biotechnology, the staff, Dr. Alok, everybody that has been doing something in favor of this activity, I want to thank you for the preparation of this excellent activity, and I hope that those who are visiting us, then you have a pleasure stay here in the island, in particular in Barranquitas. I guarantee you that Puerto Rico weather is nice, but in Barranquitas it's nicer. Okay, so thank you to all speakers. We really appreciate that you have dedicated this time to be with us today. And in addition to that, I want to thank not only U.S. Department of Agriculture, also Corteva, our institution that has made possible this activity. Many of this activity, we need money to run them. So we really appreciate all those donations that you have made. And I hope that you enjoy the presentations and willing, as myself, to learn. So welcome to Barranquitas.
Thank you, Dr. Negron, for your greetings. Now we will begin with a symposium. All of our guests will talk about topics related to Caribbean agriculture. After each presentation, we will have 5 minutes for the questions and answer sessions. The first speaker is Dr. Sonia Peters. She has a doctoral degree from the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus in Barbados and a major in chemistry. Some of her experience is an educator in Harris College, engaged a collaborative academic anti-cancer study of Caribbean medical plants in 2007, co-supervisor of postgraduate students at the Department of Biochemistry, Faculty of Medical Science, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus, Trinidad and Tobago. Established the nonprofit the Biocultural Education and Research Program in 2017. She won the first place in a phyto-innovation competition for the development of a nutraceutical for mitigation of diabetes from the plants used traditionally. We now invite Dr. Sonia Peters.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you're hearing me clearly. I need affirmation. Thank you very much. I came into the island on Wednesday evening. I was greeted by two lovely ladies who work at the campus, and clearly from the conversation, it indicated the deficiency of my Spanish. But at least I can welcome you all. Buenos dias. I want to extend gratitude to the Chancellor of the Interamerican University of Puerto Rico, Dr. Juan Negros. We met last year at our symposium, Plants and Planting for the Future. And that was really very important to have him there. He was our keynote speaker. I wish to thank administrative staff, of course. I welcome the invited speakers, students, and general attendees. This discussion about Caribbean agriculture is vital. I am ever becoming more and more concerned as we grapple with the impacts of climate change, environmental shocks, and ability to respond to that. And COVID-19 did demonstrate that. We're going to hear about the science behind how we can make agriculture better. We're going to hear about looking at the genomics in our plant studies. We're going to hear about conserving our soil and the new technologies that are available. But from my position, I think it is so important to engage our communities. I think our communities are unaware of the challenges, and if we want them to respond, it's important that we expose them and educate them. The Biocultural Education and Research Program, as said, was initiated in 2017, and when we received our funding from the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program, it was on the cusp of COVID coming in, and we had to be very creative. How do we reach out to our communities? And we've been able to do that, and I will be sharing some of the activities that we have engaged. So I'm hoping that I'm going to manage the technology well. There we go, great. So from my position, I want to talk about promotion of agriculture via citizen engagement and community-based models. So straight into it. I'm the director of the Biocultural Education and Research Program, and we have as our objective promotion of Caribbean plant biodiversity for food security and health via platforms of education and research. So putting things into context, as I said in my opening statement, I think it is vital that we engage our community in a citizen science platform. For me, too often, the science that we do does not get out into the community where it is important. It doesn't get out to the practitioners. It remains behind our vaults, in our journals, and we have to build bridges between science and our communities. Indigenous agricultural knowledge has served us well for eons. Why are we discarding it? The Caribbean is defined as a hotspot, 72% endemism, which is unique for me. And again, we are ignoring that richness. We need to be considering that. Our underutilized plants, this is outside of our diversity. We've got plants we are aware of, but we are so caught up in going to the supermarket where we can get, our iceberg lettuce and our other fancy vegetables. But we've got a lot of species that are being underutilized, and we're not maximizing on our resources. We need to look at that. And the youth. These are the ones who have to take agriculture forward. We can no longer ignore them. So our platforms must reach out to the youth. Identifying the challenges and solutions. Do not let that mathematical background fool you. I did some mathematics, but when they began to tell me about imaginary numbers, I hopped out. But it is philosophically presented as we've got a lot on the table. How do we bring it together to find workable solutions? So I'm going to go through some of the challenges. It's estimated that 60% of our food requirement for the estimated 44 million citizens of the Caribbean comes from imports. For the period here, 2018 to 2020, look at that food import bill, $14 billion US. We're talking about economies that are small and struggling. And I'm not putting that in a negative way, but we can imagine a small economy if you're putting that percentage of your gross domestic product into buying food externally. That's not sustainable. Climate change impacts. Climate change is impacting us in many ways. They're listed here. Some of the islands have experienced severe drought, impacts by severe weather systems. We know about Maria, which had a devastating impact on Puerto Rico, Dominica, and actually a swath across the Caribbean. Excess rainfall, and this would have impacted on the dynamics of agriculture. Our soils, our ability to harvest would have lost a lot of food product as well. So how are we responding to the challenge of climate change? Interestingly, the CARICOM community, the islands that are signed onto CARICOM, have come together and looked at a Vision 25 by 2025. This is in response to challenges that I've listed, but that economic impact. And the aim is to reduce that food import bill by 25%, hopefully by 2025. Is that a reality? The focus is going to be on selected commodities here in terms of increasing productivity. And we see here cocoa, meats, poultry, root crops, etc. So what are we selecting? I know they've got a program, but is this a coherent program? And for me, I am ever talking about our plant biodiversity in the Caribbean. That needs to be a focus of our strategies. We need to look at our endemic species and see how best we can rope them in to our agriculture. So I went and I searched to determine what is it that we are so dependent on. Most of our imports are actually coming from the US, and here are the things that we are importing. Do we need to be importing these? Is that working? I'll try one more time. Probably I'm not doing that well. Let's go back. So, food preparation and ingredients, non-alcoholic beverages, processed foods, alcoholic beverages. Then the Caribbean produces some of the best quality rum. What are we importing from the US? Fats and oil, snacks, too much of that. Prepared and preserved meats, condiments, sauces, jams. Can we, replace some of that collectively across the Caribbean? Just to look a little closer at the climate change impacts, and this is really extracted from Climate Tracker, which is looking at agriculture in the Caribbean facing destructive climate impacts. Fingers are a little fast. When we talk about the climate change, and temperature is one of the big issues across the Caribbean. It has been extremely hot this year, and those that are monitoring for the parameters, I think 2023 has been listed as the hottest year relative to monitoring. This, of course, has had a devastating impact. Livestock is one of the areas that suffered, especially husbandry around chickens, and that has led to limited supplies in Barbados and I suppose across the Caribbean. I've talked about the increase in the hurricane systems, and I think that weather is changing in a way that does not match with the modeling systems. This is probably where I should really have done some more mathematics, but I find that our modeling systems are not being able to predict how the hurricanes are behaving in terms of intensity, in terms of the frequency they're coming across. And even when predicted paths are put out there, invariably in recent times, they're not accurate. So we need to have a big look at that. Okay, so pushing on, my pitch for plant biodiversity value and food security. And this is coming, I'm just going to go right down. The FAO has been sort of putting that information out there, hoping that it will be incorporated in strategies for nurturing agriculture. But here it is stated that Latin America and the Caribbean host a rich genetic resource base that must be preserved for the world to achieve the SDG goals. I was fascinated to hear that, for the world to achieve. Second point, because of that genetic resource, again, we need to be looking at how we can harness that resource. We see some examples that have been suggested here. And then the last point for me, the FAO states that the region has a huge variety of wild foods. I really don't like the term wild, but these are not domesticated, non-traditional, underutilized edible plants, and under varied ecosystems. And we need to have a revisit of how indigenous knowledge has preserved species, and I'm going to be focusing on plants, of course, and how are we reincorporating biodiversity in agriculture. The importance of a citizen-focused model. I'm big on education, and we need to look at education in a wider context. And this was extracted from a very interesting study demonstrating the limitations here in terms of engaging our citizens. What they did was to do a big search of journal entries to see what research is being done about incorporating citizen science in strategies. And their conclusion that the potential role of citizen science is not being considered effectively. It's not being explored. We're not communicating with our farmers effectively, and we are disregarding the potential of communication and with our people on the ground, and them going out and being science communicators. We think they're not possible, possibly going to be effective, but I always claim that these are the people who laid the foundation for our agriculture, and traditional systems need to be drawn on, and the practitioners that are still incorporating traditional systems, we need to respect them, we need to empower them, we need to get them out into the community. And of course, we cannot ignore the value of social media. I've got a double-barrel view about social media, but there's a potential here to reach our community by embracing the better models of social media. The value of traditional knowledge. Now, I refer to this as backyard farming, where we're talking about when I was much younger, and within our communities, there was a vibrant system of growing your own food, rearing your own animals, and employing the tradition that has been passed down. I call it backyard farming, but we're really talking about small holding farmers. And so we had persons who had the small backyard, we had persons who had larger areas, but they were all growing their own food based on traditional systems. The second point here, the third point really, about using traditional systems and pest management, and I put cow urine in brackets because we discard, these activities. Now, I'm not telling you to go and collect buckets of cow urine and throw it over your produce, but what is it about the cow urine that was effective? And studies are now really going into doing the revisit. What is it about the cow urine? Of course, there's urea, nitrogen, increasing nitrogen content. They're finding antibacterial agents that can help with disease. And the point here is there's a lot of older technologies, older systems that we have disregarded, but we need to embrace them, see how we can modernize and incorporate them as we go forward with our nurturing agriculture. I say free range, we hear about free range animals. That is common practice. All of the backyards had the chickens and the ducks and the goats and the sheep, and they walked wherever on the neighbor's land. I know that could cause issues now, but can we go into a community and embrace that? Can we get people coming together and agree that we're going to allow this activity to happen, but in a very structured, coherent manner to achieve effective results? Yeah, and this last comment by Melash et al. Says, indigenous agricultural knowledge is observed as an important national human capital. That is so important to me. An important national human capital to improve crop productivity and enhance sustainable agricultural development. Fostering and documentation of indigenous agricultural knowledge can promote the wider use of organic crop production methods and sustain environmental health. So he's really enforcing my ideas. I think it's always good when we can look around and see others who are thinking likewise. I'm always obsessed with this image of the potato diversity happening in Peru. Here we see they've got 3,000 varieties of potato in Peru. But these, in modern times, would not make it into the big concept of supermarkets. Supermarkets have been destructive. They have pulled us away from our local resources. They have skewed our thinking about what our product should look like. And we believe that the very good potato is the English or Irish potato. Nice and brown on the outside, nice and plump, but what about its nutritional content? These potatoes here are healthy. I say that because look at the variety of colors there. They're rich in phytonutrients. They're rich in polyphenols, and these are all good indicators for health. So what are we doing? We need to get the message out there that we don't want only the cosmetic looking product. We need to maybe move away from the supermarket ideology and embrace more of our smaller market systems. And I was talking about that with some of the colleagues here today, that we are not seeing those markets blossoming as they used to. And it is because we, unfortunately, like the concept of going to the big supermarket, but we're losing our biodiversity. So now I'm going to look at some models that are of value to the Caribbean, some international, more Caribbean, and a few Barbados. And I'm also going to look at some of the work that the biocultural education has been doing in modeling our plant systems in Barbados. This one I'm particularly excited about, the periodic table of foods. I know that just the mention of the periodic table must produce some anxiety in persons who were not fans of chemistry. But I am indeed a chemist, and my chemistry really has laid the foundation for me to appreciate the chemistry of food. And the periodic table of foods is an initiative by the Rockefeller Foundation. There are other institutions that are involved as well. But the idea here is to expand on the foods that we rely on. You'll see a very damning situation here where 75% of the global food resources is derived from 12 plants and 5 animals. That is so ridiculous to me. Maize and corn and one other, there are 3 of them that make up 50% of that. External shocks are damaging, and these external shocks require that we look internally. So how do we augment those 12 plants and 5 animals as sources of food? The periodic table of food is looking to have an expansive program where analytical methods are provided to practitioners on the ground to allow a proper analysis of the foods that we have access to. And I was honored to be part of the initial panel looking at recommending plants that should be incorporated in that periodic table of foods. And there are some that I'll talk about a little later. One example is the jackfruit, because we want to include foods that are versatile. And jackfruit, which is related to the breadfruit tree, has versatility in that it is also used as a replacement for meats. So increasing the number of foods that we're dependent on is very important, and this initiative was launched recently, and I hope that the university, the Interamerican University, will become part of this, so that we can analyze the foods that we're using. We can determine where the nutrient density lies, and therefore be able to have a list of foods that we really should be incorporating or reincorporating. Here is one of the organizations working in the Caribbean. It's the Trees That Feed Foundation. And they have been very diligent in terms of tree planting mechanisms, but not just tree planting, planting of food trees that will yield food. And we see here that they've been able, it's 300,000, should be another zero there, across the Caribbean. They're big on promoting agriculture, not just the planting of the food, but what are we doing with the fruit? Highly versatile, and they're also developing agribusinesses going into the community and demonstrating how the fruit can be involved in agro-processing. And there's this beautiful educational platform for youth. I think I have, okay, probably that's later. So here we have another initiative. This is the Barbados arm of Slow Food International, and they played a very important part during COVID. COVID-19 really demonstrated our food insecurity, and they were able to form intimate relationships with farmers who donated food that they grew so that they could produce nutritious products that could be provided for persons who were at the peak of food insecurity. Women and children were key to make sure that their nutrition was held up, that of course they can go to school where that was allowable based on the restrictions of COVID. Because if you're not well fed, you're not going to learn well. So they've played a very important role here in terms of integrating the small farmers who became empowered as they were part of a movement and became motivated to continue planting, and of course had a source for their food. It wasn't just a case of planting without a guarantee as to where your product will go. So as we nourish resilience, I state that knowledge sharing is vital, as we're doing here today. Activation of the public is key. This is not going to work unless we create investment within our public. Innovation is fundamental. My time is running out. Yes, so innovation is fundamental, and youth engagement is paramount. So the Bicultural Education and Research Program, we are doing our part. We've had symposia. We're looking at varied tools for citizen engagement, and again, we're targeting our youth. So we've had 3 symposia. The objective is to expose our community to trends in application of plant biodiversity, exposure to trends in agriculture, establishing research linkages. We've developed programs with intimate relationships with our farmers, looking at how we can model what they're doing and concepts of farm to table, but with innovation in there, with the inclusion of underutilized plants. New use agriculture here has been coined by James Simon of Rutgers University. I think there's someone here probably working with Jim. He has influenced me quite a lot. I was able to attend one of his workshops in New Jersey, and he has a very integrated approach. He's been working across Africa, where the incorporation of utilized plants is key in his approach. So I'm almost out of time. I'm going to wrap this up quickly. We have done a pilot study on underutilized plants. This is Portulaca oleracea. It's considered a weed and not useful, but it's a great medicinal and also loaded with nutrients. What we call wild spinach is another one that's rich in vitamin content, mineral content, and we were looking at domestication models. Innovation in the youth, you wouldn't believe that these are plant-based wines, and the one on my right is made from the breadfruit. Some beautiful wines. We have to be innovative in showing where we can take our food. We've been developing pasta products with breadfruit as well, and getting the youth involved. We worked with Global Resolve from Arizona State University recently. Had a lovely weeks program. We went into the schools promoting growing your own food. The kids, you can see, were all engaged. We provide planters for them, plant material, and they were all very invested. And this beautiful emblem, I think I want to say, will accompany the plants that they're growing so they can look and see the importance of what they're doing and be proud and be empowered. And we hope to provide a scholarship for kids who want to study agriculture further. So I think that I am over my time. Thank you very much.
You say there.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
To keep up with the schedule, unfortunately, we will have time for only one question. So if anybody has a question, please, you can raise your hand. We can hand you a microphone. If you're online, then you can write a question in the chat.
Yeah, there's one question here.
Good morning, and thank you for your presentation. Ricardo Burgos from the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust.
Yes.
I was really impressed with the goal of 25%.
Yeah.
It's pretty aggressive. So I wanted to know if you know where that goal is at the moment.
Yes, and I'm basing this on reports. It is said that they're happy that we are marching in the right direction. I agree with you, however, that 2025 is an aggressive time frame, and we're likely not to get there, but we're seeing movement in that persons understand that it's critical, and we're getting participation at the level of government, we're getting participation at the level of civil society. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We'd like to invite now Dr. Jim Giovannoni. He is Director of the United States Department of Agriculture, Agricultural Research Service, Robert W. Hawley, Center for Agriculture and Health, located on the Cornell University campus at New York, where he also holds adjunct professor appointment both with Cornell and the Boyce Thompson Institute for Plant Research. He has been with the USDA since the year 2000 and was previously a professor of horticultural science at Texas A&M University. He received his bachelor's degree from UC Davis and his doctoral degree from UC Berkeley. He was elected to the U.S. National Academy for Science in 2016. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is the microphone working okay? Okay. Buenos dias. That's all my Spanish. Gracias. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here. My second time in Puerto Rico. For those of you who were at the talk the last time, some of the slides are the same, but maybe you forgot, so that'll be good. And I'd also especially like to thank all of you for attending, the special guests and the dignitaries of the university and other universities And thank you very much, Alok, who's been a good friend and a colleague, and for bringing me to Puerto Rico in January, because this is my house last week. So it's a very nice time to leave. Okay, before I continue, I just want to acknowledge the people in the laboratory who do all of the work. This was when we planted our field trial last summer, and a few of those who were not out in the field with us. Very happy today to have my wife, Julia Vrebalov, who's also a member of the lab and has done some of the work I'll tell you. Okay, for about 30 years, we've been interested in fruit in our laboratory, and I know fruit are not just important in general to human health and nutrition, but certainly important in Caribbean agriculture. And so fruit are formed from parts of the flower, and the purpose of the fruit is really to protect the developing seed. And fruits take different forms that not only protect but help with dispersal of the seed. So some of these forms can include structures that will scatter the seed, kind of dehiss and throw the seeds out. Others, like some of these up on the right, will be caught by the wind and blow away. Some will attach to the fur of animals and be carried off. But we're especially interested in these guys on the bottom, fleshy fruits. Fruits that have evolved to become attractive, nutritious, flavorful, so that an organism like us, often referred to as frugivores, will pick them up, eat them, and disperse the seed somewhere else. And they're an important part of our nutrition and of food security. And so we work a lot on tomato. I apologize, I'll tell you a lot about tomato today. I know you grow some in the Caribbean, so that's good. But the thing to keep in mind is much that we learn in a system like this, we can translate to other systems. So we identify interesting genes. They have relevance in many other fruits. And so tomato, like many fruits, does a lot of things that are common, even though those fruits may look very different. They often convert their starch to sugars. They change texture, so they get soft, right? They accumulate interesting pigments. We saw some of those from Sonia a while ago with the potatoes. Some of these are the same. Often these are either carotenoids or polyphenols, okay? And they give us a lot of the colors. Chlorophyll, the green, is often degraded. Aroma volatiles are produced, so they smell ready to eat. Some of those volatiles, very interestingly, are derived from nutritional molecules. So they're actually telling us there's important nutrition here in the fruit. Protective compounds like glycoalkaloids that plants produce to make you sick if you try taking a bite out in the fruit, those are removed. So it's all part of this process to make it attractive so you eat it. When you think of what the plant normally does, a lot of chemistry to protect itself, the fruit's a very different tissue of the plant. And a lot of this in many fruits is driven by the hormone ethylene. You remove ethylene or block its signaling, and you delay or inhibit fruit ripening. And as the cell walls change and the texture changes, you also create opportunities for pathogens to attack. Pathogens that normally don't attack an unripe fruit. And that's why ripe fruit rot. And that's the way the plant ensures the seeds get out if an animal doesn't eat them. And what we're interested in is understanding what controls all of this and how can we take that knowledge to influence the good parts of a fruit ripening and maybe inhibit some of those that are challenges for us. Because when you think about food security, fruit are a little bit of a trouble, right? A lot of our staples are seeds and tubers, tissues and organs that are designed by evolution to persist for a long time. So they're easy to store. Fruits are not like that at all. They decay, they go bad, and we lose a lot. And so when you're thinking about food security and nutritional security, there are unique attributes to many fruits nutritionally. And also, we lose a lot. So even though we might produce, if we don't get it to the consumer, it doesn't really do anyone any good. So how can we understand the ripening process and maybe reduce some of that loss while still maintaining or even improving quality? So that challenge of that loss is something we spend a lot of energy, a lot of money, and a lot of effort on. And really, we do this in several different ways. One that I'll focus on is genetics. So we use variants that maybe have slower ripening to give us longer shelf life and allow the fruit to persist longer. But there's also a lot of early harvest. So many fruits you buy in the supermarket were harvested before they even started to ripen. Why? Because they're hard, and that makes them easy to ship. They can go a long distance, and unfortunately, or maybe sometimes fortunately, because it allows us to produce a lot of our agriculture is very intense, highly efficient in localized areas, and then we got to move it all over the place. So it has to last days just to get to where the market is, much less survive for some time when you take it home. And finally, a lot of controlled atmosphere, cold storage, modified atmospheres, things that will slow down the metabolism and slow down the ripening process and allow the fruit to persist longer. So a lot of effort goes into these challenges. Unfortunately, all of them really result in fruit that aren't fully ripe and not necessarily optimal quality, and consumers are often dissatisfied. And you know that. If you pick a tomato or a peach or a papaya directly off the plant when it's mature and eat it, it's much better than when you buy it in a supermarket, because it's been through this process. Not that this is bad, it's kind of what we have to do the way we produce a lot of our fruits. Okay, you don't need to know any of this, but what we've done in our lab, and now many labs, have been trying to understand what are the genes that control this process. And Julia, who is here, identified the first transcription factors. These are genes that regulate other genes and kind of control the cascade. And since then, many in our lab and other labs have identified dozens, many more than are shown here, of these genes that we know are important. But how do we take advantage of that information? Well, one way is we can look at the diversity of available germplasm, so varieties from around the world, and ask, okay, if we know a gene's important, can we find lines where maybe if we want more of it, it's expressed more highly, or just the opposite in others? So understanding better the germplasm that we have is important to enabling breeders to take advantage of this information. Okay, another more direct approach is biotechnology, genetically modified organisms, where we might engineer a DNA fragment and introduce it into a plant cell to cause changes in expression of a gene of interest, generate plants from that individual cell, and eventually end up with a plant with a new trait. That's a lot of work. Sometimes it's very worth doing. But it also requires a lot of regulatory costs to meet with all the compliance. And that's why you typically only see GMOs in very large crops, crops that are worth the investment of all the energy and the money, because it's just not worth it to do this sometimes in smaller crops. Nevertheless, the first GMO commercial product in a plant was actually a fruit. It was tomato. Back in the late 1980s, it was targeting a gene called PG, or polygalacturonase. This gene's involved in the softening of the fruit. It breaks down the polygalacturonic material in between adjacent cell walls. And the idea is just like a brick wall. If you liquefied the mortar, everything would start moving around and you get softer. Didn't really prove to be that correct, but nevertheless, the product was the first product that was developed with a GMO. More recently, people are interested in gene editing. And gene editing is a different approach where you take proteins like the CRISPR-Cas9 system and set up a system with DNA sequences to guide them to a gene of interest. And it causes cleavage or a cut in that DNA. And then the natural repair process fixes it and sometimes creates mutations. Those mutations are indistinguishable from natural mutations that happen in the environment all the time. So it's thought that those types of modifications might be easier to regulate and also easier for consumers to accept because there's a lot of apprehension in the community with consumers, not really understanding what GMOs are. Are they dangerous? Some of this might allow us to bypass some of those arguments because they'll be more like natural genetic variation. Okay, why do we work on tomato? It's probably kind of obvious. You put a tomato seed in the ground, you wait 3 months, you have a fruit. Imagine if you're working with a fruit tree, you might have to wait a couple of years. If you're a student, might be your brother younger brother who comes in and finishes your project because you don't have enough time. Also in tomato, we have a lot of mutants that tell us about ripening, and it's easy to do these types of genetic manipulations. And finally, a lot of important tools, genomic tools like good genome sequences that help us understand the genes and things that we work with in tomato. So a lot of what we do is with tomato. These are some of the mutants that I mentioned earlier, and we've identified the genes that have been altered in these mutations. And just imagine, if you have a mutant like RIN up on top that doesn't ripen, that tells you whatever that gene is, it must be pretty important for ripening, right? So that's why we work with these mutations. They fall into 3 classes: transcription factors, genes that are really these signal transduction genes are mostly genes involved in ethylene, right? The important hormone for ripening. And lastly, plastid development, which is really just the color of the fruit. Now, again, Julia had identified the first 2 of these up on top. And natural mutations in these are used in production of many of the varieties of tomatoes that you'll find in the market. So for example, RIN, it doesn't ripen at all, but if you make a heterozygote, one normal, one mutant copy, you get a slow ripening, long shelf life tomato, kind of pink color. You probably see these when you buy them at the store. You bring them home, they look like a tomato. They taste more like a cucumber, right? So, but they last a long time. So it's a useful trait, but we need to work on that and get some of that color and flavor back. And the fact is the breeders have done an excellent job of that in recent years. Another one called uniform ripening, an actual wild tomato has a green top. You never see that anymore because 100 years ago this mutation was identified that gets rid of that green top and it's uniformly red. That's bred into almost every tomato you see. High pigment, this one's not used so much because it causes some other problems with the plant, but it gives very bright red fruit. And finally, maybe you've seen in the supermarket something called Kumato tomatoes, the variety developed in Japan. It's a gene underlying this mutation called green flesh. It's a stay green protein. And what it does is it keeps plastids, green plastids in the fruit. So you have kind of this red, green, almost brownish color of the fruit. And some interesting flavors associate with that as well. So the natural mutations are used, and these genes also tell us something about how ripening is controlled. And again, one of the things we're interested in is, okay, we learned something in tomato. Is that just tomato? Well, for example, the RIN gene, if we look through the phylogeny of fleshy fruits, we find a similar gene in every one that's induced during ripening. And in fact, working with various collaborators, we've knocked some of these out just to prove that they actually have ripening function. And indeed they do. Knock it out in strawberry, they don't ripen. In melons, they don't ripen. In bananas, they ripen but slow. So you add shelf life to the fruit. So conservation of function. So things we learn in tomato, if you're interested in mangoes, papayas, pineapples, something else, you can probably find a similar gene. And that's probably a good target if you're trying to extend shelf life. And again, a second mutation, NOR, up there also blocks ripening. That's a different transcription factor. We can find it in strawberry. There's many of these genes, but one that's highly expressed in the fruit. That's the red line. Knock it out, and the fruit don't ripen. So it clearly has an important function there. We run out of mutants, so we look for other places to find new genes. One way is to just say, well, what genes are expressed high when the fruit's maturing? So we find some of those, and this is an example. It's got a funny name. It's called LOB1. It's another transcription factor. If we knock it out, the fruit look pretty normal. They ripen. But what we notice is they're very firm, so they don't get very soft. When we ask, well, what does that do? It's a regulator of other genes that control changes in cell walls. So that kind of makes sense. So it's a little different from something like RIN that seems to control everything. This just controls that textural part of the ripening process. And maybe that's a good target if that's what we're trying to modify. And this just shows those fruit, if we repress that gene, lose their water much less easily, which is a good indicator of how long the shelf life of the fruit is. So, okay, we have lots of genes, we find more genes, they have a lot of roles in ripening. It's kind of like this picture. We've got all these parts, but we don't really know how they go together and how they interact. So how can we understand that process better, right? If you know nothing about your car, when the battery dies, you learn that the battery is very important, right? That's what a mutant is like for a plant breeder. It tells you whatever that gene is must be very important for that process. So thanks to a lot of advances in technology in the last 10 years in particular, and then even the last few years, we can get information about genomes much more readily than we could. Right? The first genome of tomato took about 10 years to generate. It was a very good genome sequence, but this is just the number of genomes starting from scratch that have been developed in tomato up to 2023. So 75 different varieties have had their genome sequenced. Not just varieties, but also wild relatives of tomato. So we can capture much more genome information. And how do we use that? So this is just one example. This is Zhang Junfei on the right, a former student and a professor now at Cornell, and his postdoc Li Gao, working with my postdoc Itai Ganda, took all the genome sequences that had been out there and asked, okay, what are all the unique genes? Basically, what are all the new genes compared to that original genome sequence? Just like if we sequenced all our genomes, most of the genes are the same, but there's a few different ones. That's why we don't all look like me. Thank God for you. So we find these new genes. One that Itai was interested in is a gene called TOM-LOX. Chemistry is not so important, but what it does is it breaks down fatty acids. And some of those products are things you smell and you recognize as fruity aromas. And it turns out that they also, as they break down, they interact with carotenoids. That's what makes the fruit red or orange. And those also give you a fruity aroma. So this gene was important in terms of that fruitiness. But what they found when they looked, and ignore all of this, just the part on the left here, if they looked at all the different genomes, the wild tomatoes, red is where that gene is present. Almost all of them have it. But then as breeders and, if we domesticated and cultivated tomato, we lost that gene. We don't see it in modern varieties, except the most modern varieties. Those are out here where it seems to be coming back. And that's because probably until about 40, 50 years ago, tomato breeders didn't pay too much attention to what a tomato tasted like or smelled like. Just a lot, right? You needed yield, and they needed to be red. That's what the grower was paid for. Fill the box with big red things. Nobody cared what it tasted like because it's going to be processed. It's going to go in your salad. You're going to put ranch dressing all over it. Who cares, right? But as consumers really did care more recently, the breeders have focused more on these traits. So something we're doing in the lab is, in tomato, it's very similar to with potato, in that there's all these wild species, all this genetic diversity, and very little of it is what we actually use out here, right? So what that means is that there's lots of information, lots of opportunity to do things that we can't normally do with the genetic material we focus on if we cast a wider net and understood those differences better. So we're focusing on just this part of this tree, the cultivated tomato, and some of its closest wild relatives, and asking, what do those genomes tell us that we didn't already know? So we've created a collection, about 200 accessions, that include the cultivated tomato, that's really these here, and then these wild relatives, close relatives from which the cultivated tomato was derived. And we're characterizing traits, particularly associated with fruit, and we're also looking at gene expression. And we're looking at the genomes. And we're asking, can we connect those things? Can we see differences in a gene? For example, on the bottom, this is a gene involved in carotenoid metabolism. So basically breaking down carotenoids, which are responsible for the color. So one thing that happens if you break down a lot of them, your color changes. One version of the gene has this insertion shown by the pink. When you have that insertion, the gene's much more highly expressed. So without insertion are these dots on the right, with insertion, on the left, and then with the insertion on the right. So that tells us, okay, if we want to breed for more of this, maybe to change color, we can select lines that have that difference compared to the others. And you can imagine you can do that with every gene if you have a trait associated with it. So here's an interesting example of kind of where we're trying to go and how this can come back to a lot of other fruit crops. We just took one gene, a member of the chaperonin family. These are proteins that facilitate folding of other proteins and stability of proteins, and they're mainly associated with stress tolerance. So when you're chilled or heated or nutrient stressed, these proteins help stabilize things. And what we did was look through this collection of 200 accessions where we had all this gene expression data and just said, let's find some lines that are high in this protein. Let's find some that are low. So different levels of expression. And you can see that here. So we find lines high, and over there you don't detect the protein. So we then just took those lines and we stressed them. How did we stress them? We put them in a hot growth chamber, 45 degrees for 3 hours. The ones with high levels of this protein, they look fine. The other ones all died. I apologize for the blurry picture, but they were dying so fast. It was a little blurry. So what that means is we understand now something about what that function of that gene is. We also know now what varieties we might want to use in breeding to select for more tolerant lines. And we did it while we used biotechnology to understand the expression without making a GMO. Again, not that we think there's anything wrong with GMOs, but there is concern in the community. So sometimes maybe we can get to the genetic end we want to in terms of a modified trait without having to go that route. Okay? So in short, what we're doing here in tomato, you could do in any crop where you have a lot of diversity. And there are collections, diversity collections, for virtually every important fruit crop out there. So if you can capture that diversity of the genomes, understand how the genes are expressed in those different accessions, all of this is very easy with modern sequencing technology, and then capture phenotypes that you're interested in, whether it's color, texture, shelf life, nutritional quality. You can associate those differences in the genome with changes in expression to the traits you want, and then do selections or do direct biotechnology, gene editing, or a GMO to select for the traits of interest that you're looking for. So in summary, okay, I timed myself pretty good. Ripening's controlled by a lot of genes. Many of these have conserved functions in evolution. And with biotechnology, we have opportunities better to understand them and also to manipulate them. And we can develop systems where if we have enough information of genome diversity, we can connect it to traits and use that to feed our models of selection. So these are just many of the people who do all the work. I do none of the work. I get to come to great places like this and give talks. This is why you want to be a scientist if you're students out there. And just always remember, fruits are fun. So thank you.
We will now have the session of questions and answers. have a question here and also there. You will be handed a microphone.
Thank you for this information. I think it's very important in this way to teach people and give the information of what we can do with technology in agriculture. And the question is how this kind of research can separate some money or some budget to make the information available and make it like an enforcement of bringing a reality that we're forcing or we're facing of drug node, of a lot of things that this kind of technology can help to produce more and in several conditions of the weather and conditions. And because I think there's a like opposition in this kind of urban agriculture. How can I say that? This kind of movements that we're establishing right now of organic agriculture, and how we can, as researchers, our people of science, can pass that membrane and goes directly to this kind of production. Because I think, in my opinion, there's like a wall or we don't want GMOs or something that looks similar to it. And what you're doing or this organization are doing to present the reality that they're not nocive, they can help to improve food security. That's my question.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I wish I could give you a simple answer, but I think a lot of it is really found in demonstration and demonstration of targeting traits that consumers can appreciate, right? So traits that for example, herbicide resistance is a great one, incredibly important, saves a lot of money, but the consumer doesn't feel it, right? They just, oh, that's GMO now, and if I'm worried about GMO, well, that's an issue. So I think one important thing is to target traits, for example, nutritional traits or traits that allow a crop that will grow in a more challenging environment, so that the grower sees the need for it, but also the consumer can appreciate it. So I think we need just more examples. We're trying to do some modifications, for example, with heirloom varieties of tomato. Varieties that you can grow in your garden but can never be produced commercially because they just don't survive. And ask, can we make them a more commercial type variety that maybe a small grower or an organic grower could produce with higher quality but with better shelf life? That's the problem with a lot of these. So I think, as scientists, we need two things. One, good examples, and two, we need more kind of outreach extension to relay the message, right? The message is good. And I think also the fact that there's a lot of opportunities, with genomics, enabling and understanding genomes has allowed for most of the breeding that's done. It's not GMO, but it's taking the information that's developed with biotechnology and now adapting it into really what is equivalent to still a traditional breeding program, but much more focused and using these tools to guide the breeding. So I think, there's one opportunity to kind of bypass the GMO issue, which was part of my point. And two, because if you don't need to use it, then you don't have to use it. But two, also to just create the examples where the consumer actually appreciates it and eventually says, yeah, I want that one because it's better for me, right? So I think we need more of those examples. That's my long-winded short answer, but a very good question.
Hi, thank you very much. David Gieter Alvarez with the Impact Studio, Futura. I think a lot about impact investment and food security here in PR and, of course, the Caribbean. And I wanted to understand a little bit more from your perspective what financial instruments, guarantees, insurances could also help to bolster, embedding more of this research into traditional agriculture or new and up-and-coming agricultural startups. I know that the USDA has also announced different insurance programs for controlled environment agriculture, and I think there's a opportunity for R&D there too. But you mentioned a bit about kind of consumer incentive, but I just wanted to get a sense from your position if you've seen any other kind of interest from impact investors or lenders who are creating kind of instruments to make it easier to do. I guess that's one question I had. And the other thought I had was, do you think that insurance companies would find the value of genetic diversity as like commodity security? Like, how do you look at genetic diversity and commodity security from that perspective as well?
Okay, wow, those are very good questions, and you're out of my expertise a little bit, particularly from the perspective of insurance, but certainly the value of genetic diversity, right? I mean, that, Sonia's point about how so much of what we consume is derived from just very few crops, and actually from those very few crops, a very narrow band of the possible genetic diversity that's available within them. So there's certainly value there. I can't address how an insurance component of the agricultural system would view that, and but certainly there's value there to the locations, the regions from which that genetic diversity is native, right? And the fact is, in the past, that it's often been larger developed countries like the U.S. go in, capture that diversity, bring it out, use it, and so the value doesn't translate to the local communities as well. I think there's efforts now to change that, to make sure that some of that value actually goes back to those areas where it came from. But certainly, I think we always have to remember that millions of years of evolution have been doing the honing and refining that we try to do, like that with one GMO or one gene. So the point is that information and that value is out there in natural biodiversity. How do we incentivize the investment in it? I can't answer that very well. I could tell you, though, for example, in the USDA, so one of the problems, with things like, precision breeding, genomic-enabled approaches, is that smaller crops, more local crops, they just don't have the infrastructure. They can't make the investment to take advantage of those tools. But the fact is, the same tools that were developed, say, for use in maize or wheat, you can apply them. You just need a little more information about the genomes, and then you can turn that same crank if you have the genetic diversity. So there is a program within USDA that's called Breeding Insight. And what it tries to do is target smaller crops that are important to smaller grower communities, so-called specialty crops, and basically apply those tools to enable breeders to more effectively bring in desirable traits. So that's a government program, but I think that's the kind of realization that there's a lot of value, but you need some investment to actually make it tangible in terms of something that will affect those smaller growers who don't have the political power to drive the big government investments, or the commodity groups that just have their own resources to drive those, because in the end it's worth so much money to them in return. So again, a long-winded answer to a good question that I can't really address, but I certainly appreciate, the value is there. We need to realize better how to, substantiate it, make sure we invest in it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now invite Dr. Terry Hans. He is an experienced professor with a demonstrated history of working in the research industry, skilled in sustainable development, biodiversity, molecular biology, and life science. Strong education professional with a master's degree focused on zoology, animal biology from the Catholic University of Louvain, Belgium.
Thank you very much. So do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Just a minute for the micro. Okay. So I'm here with a great pleasure. It's not the first time, and it's always with a great pleasure to be here among you. And I wish to thank the organizer of this workshop, particularly Dr. Professor Negron, the Chancellor of the University, and also Dr. Alok Arun to invite me to present some points about resilient agriculture. So the first point is just to think about the main challenges of tomorrow's agriculture. And those challenges are not only for the Caribbean agriculture, but are common to the world agriculture. One of those, it's not perhaps the main one, but it's an interesting one, it's the availability and the cost of energy. Then we have, of course, the consequence of global change with the increase of extreme events, but also drove increase in temperature and different other points I will speak about. Globalization is also an important point because goods are traveling a lot, and that includes agricultural production, and that means that there is a global competition for prices, and that's also an important point in today's agriculture. That means it could be quite difficult to encounter the domestic demand at a competitive price, particularly if you are a local producer. And globalization goes also with the introduction of invasive species that can hamper some production, some agriculture production. Another point is the global biodiversity crisis. And it's a big concern because it may change the global functioning of the Earth ecosystems itself. And there are several consequences about that. An increase in regulation, for example, the strong pesticide regulations, and also a need of complexification of agriculture systems. And there are also more sociological points, such as changes in consumer behavior to our healthy and local products. That's very important. And of course, technologies are developing very fast. The communication of Jim showed us at what rapidity we have changed, and for example, the numbers of genomes of tomatoes that were sequenced, it's very impressive during the last years. And so we have also to adapt to the development of those technologies. So perhaps I start with a very brief history of agricultural development in Puerto Rico. And the agriculture in Puerto Rico at its beginning was mostly oriented toward export crops such as sugarcane, coffee, bananas, and tobacco. And in the 13th, approximately 90% of the main island was for agricultural land use, and it represents 45% of the gross domestic product. Then there are a lot of modification, and first the collapse of the sugar industry that started during the 40s, and yes, and of course sugar industry go on during several decades after that, but it decreased a lot. And it corresponds also to a period where in Puerto Rico there is a strong shift to industrialized economy. For example, many pharmaceutical companies came here on the island. And so that means that there's a decrease in food production, and the domestic food production became inadequate to satisfy domestic demands. And so, yes, we had some data about the whole Caribbean from the nice communication of Dr. Sonia Peters. And in Puerto Rico, it's even worse because since 2017, more than 85% of food is imported. And even after Maya, it decreased now a little, fortunately, but that value reached 95% of the food imported. That means, of course, a decline in local food production. That also means a decline in reduction of employment, and as Dr. Negron explained us, food security concerns. Okay, that's just an illustration of the statistics about that. So you have in red the gross national product for all sectors. In green, what consider the agricultural sectors and what it represents in percentage in blue. And presently, agriculture represents less than 1% of the gross domestic product in Puerto Rico. It was 45% in the 14th. Okay, so I take that very interesting publication, and probably Dr. Sonia Peters it's a synthesis of the factors contributing to the decline of the agriculture in the Caribbean. And I think it's common to all the Caribbean islands. And you have, for example, poor competitiveness of local farm enterprise in global trading, so the problem of globalization, the risk associated to hurricane and other natural disaster, the change in the farmers' population, the aging farmers' population, the problem of technology, of course, it's an important point, but also the loss of preferential market for traditional commodities, it's another point, also underlined by Dr. Peters, and the high cost of input and labor shortage, and an agriculture based on traditional commodities that is replaced not in all islands but by tourism and services. Okay, but fortunately, Puerto Rico presents still a strong potential for agriculture. There was that publication in 2018 about just a state of the potential for area that can be devoted to agriculture, that they use remote sensing but also census among population to do that. And of course, having good soil, land with limited slope are important. So prime quality agricultural land is a limited resources, but it still covers 42% of the Puerto Rico land area. And among those 52%, we can have 23% for specialty crops, livestock, dairy, pasture, and fruits, and the other 19% is more for timber, but also for non-timber products such as shade coffee, for example, or other kind of fruit production. And yes, that's a table that summarizes their study. And you see, of course, they introduce also in that ranking the kind of slopes. When you have slopes less than 10%, you can have mechanized agriculture. If not, it's not mechanized agriculture, but it remains possible to a lot of production. And an important point also that there is a part of the area very important for biodiversity, and that can be suited for biological conservation. Okay, so that's the map they published, and you have the upper one about what is possible for mechanization, and you see it's important, it's quite well distributed among the islands, and if we consider all what is possible for agriculture, including non-mechanized, you can see that, yes, there are really a lot of possibilities on Puerto Rico. Okay, so my first point was about energy. And that's a very interesting graph about the quantity of energy that is spent to produce food in the United States. And you can see that the production, the agricultural production in itself, represents only 21% of that energy. Then you have all transportation, the movement of goods through the different parts of the territory, the processing, packaging, food retail, restaurants and caterers, but also you can see that an important part of the energy is devoted to preparation at home of the food and refrigeration, storage, and so on, and also a part is wasted, of course. Okay, so the first point, yes, if we have a look here, for example, transport, 14% of the energy cost, we can first have a look on that, and with a very interesting concept, it's food miles. I don't know if you have ever heard about food miles, but what it represents, food miles refers to the distance food travels from the location where it is produced to the location where it is consumed. So that means the distance between the farmer's production and your plate. And what is very impressive, it's a study also that was published quite a long time ago, in 2008, but in the United States, food travels in average 1,640 kilometers between the initial producer and the final consumer. It's a lot, of course. That means a lot of energy consumption, CO2 production also. And yes, as we know, in Puerto Rico, over 80% of food is imported, so it's a very important concern. And how to diminish just that cost of energy, it's of course to produce locally. And relocating food in Puerto Rico will save a lot of energy and a substantial CO2 production. So that's an important point. And it may also increase competitivity of the food, because of course there is the cost of that transportation. And if you have a look here, yes, it's that graphic was done considering Chicago as the last destination. But for example, you can see for grapes, the foods, yes, need more than 2.100 miles to reach its destination. And then you have broccoli, asparagus, and so on. It's a global measure for all the states. Okay, so what are the positive consequences of local production? It can, of course, reduce price compared to imported food, because also you reduce the numbers of intermediaries between the producer and the consumer. That's an important point. You reduce, of course, the transportation needs. You allow also the development of crops that are more suited to local production, and that's also a very important point. To maintain crops that have a cultural importance also, such as apio, for example, here in Puerto Rico. And of course, it requests marketing effort for local production. That's an important point. And yes, we can say that there are already some projects existing in Puerto Rico. That's a very good thing presently. That's an example that was published recently about local fruit production, and it's agroecological production. Okay, the second point is climate change. And climate change in Puerto Rico could be very important also. We used to think that climate change will affect more temperate region than tropical region. That's true. But there can be also very important consequence here, and it's a report that was published some years ago. But yes, we know that the rainfall is projected to decrease, particularly in the wet season, with more frequent dry days. That means that the frequency of moderate precipitation will decrease, but the frequency of extreme precipitation will increase. That means problem of erosion, floodings, and risk, all the kind of risk associated with heavy rainfall events. Yes, not only precipitation, but of course temperature, mean and extreme temperature will increase also. That means that the numbers of days over 95 Fahrenheit at night and 80 during the day, sorry, and 85 at night will increase. At just a 1 degree increase, and we are already over that level of 1 degree. That means that 60% of the wet season is projected to be warmer than the historical maximum, and very more important numbers of days with very high temperature. And if we reach a 2 degrees increase, it's mostly all the years that will be higher than the historical record. Okay, and we know that temperature will affect sensitive crop species and ecosystems, but also may favor some pathogens and insect pests. So how to improve resilience to climate change? We know that when farmers want to produce a crop, what he wishes is to have only that crop on the area he is exploiting. So that means that it's monoculture, and we see with the presentation of Jim that yes, it's a very reduced genetic diversity, generally one varieties, and when I say one variety, it's not only at a local point, but it's quite global. Just a few varieties are feeding us. All weeds are removed to avoid competition, so that means we use herbicides. There is a chemical insect control, fungicide application, and so on. And so, yes, the present crop fields are very sensitive to disturbance. So we need to reintroduce complexity in the agriculture ecosystems to favor its resilience, while, of course, remaining compatible with profitable production. And there are a lot of techniques for that. Associated cultivation, of course, on small plots, not big parcel. Shade crops, soil plant cover, very important to limit the evaporation, for example. Water supply management, that can be a challenge in the future years. Organic fertilization with compost, so not with chemical fertilizer. Reduction of soil ploughing, of tillage, of any kind of work of soil. The use of local varieties with high genetic diversity, and we also have to find alternative ways for pest control. And I give an example about coffee. So coffee is an understory tree normally, and it's not an easy crop because when you start a coffee production, it will need 3 to 6 years to become productive. So a big investment at the beginning, and during that period, it requires a particular weather condition. So some dry period, for example, but you have a prolonged drought or rains during this time. It can spoil the flowering stage, and so you have no fruit, no cherry in your production. Excessive high temperatures will also reduce photosynthesis and growth, accelerate fruit senescence. It's an important point, and limiting fruiting, and also, of course, affect plant longevity. Another point is that a new pest was introduced to Puerto Rico in 2007. It's the coffee berry borer. It's a small coleopteran insect. I think I have a photo. Yes, it seems big, but it's indeed really, really small. that's a sherry, a coffee sherry, and you see the insect there. But it will reduce the quality of the fruit, of course. And that insect at a high thermal tolerance, it came from Africa, a temperature increase of 1 degree could lead to more rapid insect development and more generation per fruiting season. So how to improve resilience of coffee crops? The solution is about shade coffee. And so, yes, if you grow shade coffee, they are less sensitive to the coffee berry borers, for example, because you reduce the ambient temperature under the shade, under the cover. And so that means also a reduction of the growth rate of the berry borer. And you can, of course, have curative treatments. Okay, you can intercrop also coffee with banana. That's another solution. And we did a small, not a small, a true experiment about the coffee intercrop with bean, in this case, to have a soil cover. We did that in Rwanda. And yes, what we obtained is a strong reduction of aphid population growth in coffee, and also more natural enemies that were present in that crops. And it's a very good way to keep soil moisture and to favorite microclimate also. And so, yes, I just put, you have in red the aphid population growth when you intercrop coffee with bean, and in gray when it's monocultures of coffee, and in blue you have the numbers of natural enemies that are present in the intercrop coffee. So it's a very important point, and we can improve resilience in coffee crops using shade coffee. But if we have a look, I will just speed up a little, just underneath, you can see that the coffee crops area are diminishing, but also we have less and less shade coffee, so it's a point that we have to encourage. Okay, so I will pass that point. It's about an experiment that was done in the French West Indies, so Martinique and Guadeloupe, about banana production, because there are big concern there, and they were able to, by combining banana production and other crops, to reduce pesticide production a lot in just 10 years. So the last point is, of course, research, and it's very important to develop research to support the development of future agriculture. And yes, we also we already saw that it's very important to characterize varieties, to have new varieties, to take into account the genetic diversity also of the traditional varieties, searching for interest, for drought resistance, pathogen of insect resistance, and in vitro production can be important. And yes, we have also to understand better all the interaction in the agricultural ecosystem. That's an important point. And here we developed some points with Professor Negron. There are two theses, for example, one on the banana aphid symbiotic bacteria and virus transmission, the other on the pineapple mealybug. It's a very small insect that is able to transmit viruses. That's the project of the first thesis, and it's important to analyze that relation between the bacteria communities and the plants to better understand how to manage it. I will just pass through those two, and that's the second thesis. Mealybugs, you see that mealybugs, you probably already saw that insect. And some varieties, local varieties, are more resistant to mealybugs. It's important to understand why they are so resistant. So some take-home messages. We need a strong collaboration between producer, researcher, and consumer, and local communities, of course. We need pluridisciplinarity, including sociology and economy. to promote local consumption and local production, redevelop traditional crop and old varieties using genetic resources, reduce the reliance on such as fertilizer and chemical pesticide, and developed alternative ways of insect controls. Okay. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hans. We will have time for one question.
Thank you for your information. You mentioned that we had in the 1930 years, 2.2 million of soil available to farming. Now, in these days, we only have 600,000 acres and of prime farmland, and including prime farmlands. And in those prime farmland, the need of energy in Puerto Rico is focus of using those prime farmland to establish industrial energy producing from solar panels. It is an initiative of the government and the agriculture department. I would like to know about your opinion about that issue.
It's a very good point. I saw those production with solar panel in some place in Puerto Rico on just a very good agricultural soil. Yes, I think that there are probably other possibilities to put panel solar, because there are a lot of non-agricultural zone that are available to do that. And yes, it's of course my feeling. I do not really understand why they choose that kind of place to do that. And it's probably not a good solution for the future. It's very good to produce, of course, the energy in an alternative way than just use petrol or other things. But yes, there are probably other possible locations. I agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now invite Dr. David Hensley. He is a research scientist and instructor at the University of the Virgin Islands School of Agriculture. His primary research focus is on soil and water science, striving to help farmers and the community conserve the limited water resources of the Virgin Islands while expanding agriculture. His teaching role focused on agroecology program offered as a bachelor's degree in the School of Agriculture. He has lived in the islands of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands for the past 6 years, and he is originally from Houston.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay, I hope? Wonderful. Okay. It's great to be here. Thank you for hosting me, your neighbor from the Virgin Islands here in Puerto Rico. It's always a pleasure to come to the larger island, I suppose. And that gets to a little bit about what my talk for you is about today. The overall topic, food security in the Caribbean, is important to all of us because we live here and we eat. But I come from a much smaller island, and in the Caribbean, the islands come in many different sizes. So as I go through this and talk about what are the issues with food security in a smaller island, those things do have relevance for the whole Caribbean because it's kind of the island experience, I guess, when you deal with these issues. So I am from the University of the Virgin Islands, from the School of Agriculture. So before I get into it too much, just a little more about who I am, where I'm coming from. So for those who may not know too well, the Virgin Islands are just off the coast of Puerto Rico, and as you can see on the map, you can't see them that well compared to Puerto Rico. We are much smaller, but we're close by, so many things in common in that way. My research is focused on soil and water. As you can see, I thought about sending that picture in as my headshot but because that's a little bit more true to life. That's where you'll find me a lot of the time, face down in the dirt. I look a lot at that, at soil erosion and water conservation, and because those are local resources that you can't import, right? But I also teach in this School of Agriculture. We have an academic program for agriculture students, and I teach the agroecology subject. So that's the lens that I'm going to bring for you today to kind of help us use as a perspective to analyze, well, why do we import so much food, and what can we do anything about it? So that's my background. And when I came to the Caribbean for the first time 6 or 7 years ago, I immediately began to think, what if the boats stopped coming? And I don't think I'm the only one who's ever thought this before who lives here. We know that we're an import-dependent region. Of course, the Caribbean, though, is not the only place in the world that depends on imports. In the modern world, a vast swath of the earth is not food self-sufficient. It requires food from elsewhere to get by. And this is an interesting state of affairs. This is a very modern kind of thing. In the pre-colonial era in the Caribbean, it's fair to say that most islands were food self-sufficient, or else they probably wouldn't have been inhabited. So the world has changed a lot. And so in this context, you might think, well, this is modern life. We have technology, we have shipping. There are some parts of the world that have huge surpluses of food. Is this really such a problem? I mean, is it that big of a deal that we get so much of our food on a boat? And I think, that you're in this room, you're here for this conversation. You can probably expect that the answer is yes, it's a problem. But why? Why exactly? That I began to think about that more and more. Because I should say, we've been quoting figures. In the Virgin Islands, we import 98% of our food. So, I mean, and this is, again, I think you probably would find if you plotted it on a graph, the smaller your island is, probably the more food you import, just as a rule. So we think about this a lot there. So there are a few problems with importing food. You've heard of some of them already, just briefly. The fact is, it creates vulnerability. Your food security is now vulnerable to things that you can't control. If you're getting your food from Canada, United States, Russia, Brazil, now you rely on those places, and you rely on stability in those agriculturally, but also political. What if there's an outbreak of war? What if there's an embargo? All these things that we would normally like to think have nothing to do with us, now they affect our eating, our food security. So there's a dependency there that's a little bit uncomfortable, it's vulnerable. But there's also a cultural issue as well, right? That when you import food from other places, you don't have as much selection in what that food is as you maybe would like. So yes, you can import certain things that are appropriate to the food culture, but also the reality is a lot of things are going to come in that are at first rather alien to the food culture, and over time could erode the local food culture that has been passed down. So that's like a social problem, but it's one that is, I think, very real. Also, though, there's also a health issue when it comes to that imported food. I mean, we've been hearing about shelf life and so on, and it's a problem. I mean, I don't know about how bad it is in Puerto Rico, but in the Virgin Islands, you go to the grocery store, the fact is the produce in the supermarket is just not very good. And it's because it's imported, and we often feel like we're the last stop that the boat makes, But even when you're not talking about produce, the truth is, most of what we're really eating that we're importing is that shelf-stable, high-calorie dense food, the grains, the processed foods. That's what we import. But the truth is, that's also the not as healthy food for us. So the more food you import, also more than likely the more health impacts you'll have. Okay, so of course also, I don't need to tell you, others have said it's an environmental problem, of course, to ship food all over the world constantly. But then there's also this economic concern too. What if there could be an agricultural sector to our local economy? But now there's not, right? So there is an agricultural sector in the Caribbean, but it's suffering because it has to compete with food imports, right? So just some real-world examples that we're probably mostly all familiar with already. How many remember when this large ship blocked the Suez Canal a year or two ago? That was kind of funny, maybe a little bit, but also a little bit concerning to think that such a silly accident could actually, if they hadn't managed to fix that, could, I don't know, cause food to be more expensive. People start to go hungry as a result. That's sobering. And then a little less, more serious even than that, now there's wars in other places, and the Ukraine war, Russia and Ukraine, that's a major wheat producing region in the world. This could affect the price of food, COVID-19, others have said. And I don't need to tell you what that's a photo of on the top right. Maria devastated Puerto Rico, but also St. Croix. And so the food that we were eating after the storm is very different than the food we would normally eat, and it's because we're vulnerable in that way, right? So, the small island perspective. So just for your reference, there's Puerto Rico, but then below that, the island of St. Croix, where I live. The scale is rather different. I looked these numbers up, and they always even surprise me when I think about it. 80,000 people live in the territory of the US Virgin Islands. 40 times more people live in Puerto Rico. Now, we are spread across 3 different islands, so when you think of just island to island, 40,000 people live in St. Croix, so that's 80 times fewer people than this island, so it's a big difference. So that impacts economies of scale, and the smaller you get, the more true that is. Now, what do I mean by economies of scale? I'll hopefully illustrate that for you, but it just makes everything more difficult. So generally, that economy of scale affects the resources that are available to farmers. And there's a reason why importing food is easier in the modern world, why that's just what seems to happen more. When you do agriculture, when you produce food, you need inputs. You, of course, need hard inputs. These are the things you would buy and keep for several years, your truck, your tractor, your equipment, whatever it may be. And there's a long list of things that a farmer needs to do modern agriculture, right? Generally speaking, all of those things have to be imported, and it can be very difficult, expensive, annoying. You get it shipped in, it's the wrong thing. Oh, wait another year for the next one, right? But then there's also the soft inputs. These are the things you have to buy all the time: seeds, fertilizer, and everything else. Those also can be very annoying to get, and the smaller your island is, it becomes increasingly unlikely that your island actually produces that input. You have to ship that in too, just like anything else. And because of all that annoyance, time, money, everything else, a lot of local farmers in small island contexts, they go without some of these. Maybe they don't want to, but they just find in the event, in the real world, they just need to. It's time to plant, the field is ready, but I don't have one of these things. Let's go anyway. So those are the realities of a small island farmer, and that does hurt production. So they produce less and less and less and less, and so that's the trajectory. But then, of course, there's the local resources too. This is what I look at a lot. Water and land, those are limited. The smaller your island is, the less of that you have. There's no way around that. And then, of course, labor too. A lot of times the farmers in a small island like this, they are the owner-operator. No one else works on that farm but them. So when they have to be this logistical expert to ship in all these things, you can see why they might just say, forget it, I'll just do compost, fertilizer, we'll do it next year. So those are some of the problems, and they kind of create this structure that we've become familiar with. The farms of small islands are always going to be small by a global standard. And so the problem with this is that a lot of the global solutions for agriculture are designed with large farms in mind. And we can't fault them for that, because if you are just studying agriculture in general, you might, want to target the largest fraction of agriculture. That is large-scale agriculture. But that leaves us in a difficult position, because we're still exposed to those global problems, right? Last year's summer was horrible for this region, right? And the small farmers didn't really have much that they could do about it. They just kind of had to deal with it. This example here, I hope you don't see this pest in Puerto Rico. This is the mango stem borer. It targets fruit trees, breadfruit, mango, obviously. It has appeared in St. Croix, and it's been devastating fruit trees. It's a global invasive pest. But because we're so small, it's like, well, what pesticide do you use for that? Where does it come from? We don't know. We're just kind of trying to adapt. So this is a kind of a agricultural problem, scale problem. There's another issue too, though, if we want to expand agriculture and get out of this import trap that we're in. which is that, okay, if you want to expand agriculture, you need more farmers. And in the Caribbean, I think region-wide, there's a justified, I would say, apprehension about agriculture because there's an ugly history of agriculture in this region, isn't there? Slavery, plantations, and just an agriculture of a kind that I think people justifiably say, that's old-fashioned, and we want to leave that in the past. We want to move on with our lives and move into the future. So understandably, a lot of people, they say, I don't want my children to be farmers, right? This is a problem, obviously, if you want to produce food, but this is a social reality that we have to confront in the Caribbean. So that being said, though, it's not all bad, right? There is, as much as there is that history, the other thing that Caribbean islands all share is also a heritage of people producing their own food, a traditional agricultural knowledge. These things are also passed down. And so you don't have to invent a population of people who care about where their food comes from. This is already present in the region, evidenced by a conference like this one or the establishment of the School of Agriculture where I work. That was done by the local legislature, and nobody had to put them up to that. They felt it was important. So this is a benefit that we can work with. Also, it is true that we do kind of become accustomed to our imported foods, certain products that we like, but especially when it comes to the produce, we do have a kind of an advantage in our corner, which is that a lot of times you don't actually like that stuff at the store, you just get it because it's what's there, it's cheaper. But if there is an available local alternative, people do go for that when they can, right? Price is a concern, but generally that is what people like. Like at a farmer's market like that, it's always it's gonna be good. So there is a growing support for this, but we just have to think, how can we translate that into actually changing that food import situation, right? So yeah, these are strengths, but it doesn't change the fact today, which is that imports are high, and in many places they're going up. They're going in the wrong direction, right? And this is unsustainable, right? We know that, but it's not just an environmental unsustainability. Like I said, it's this continuing vulnerability on the dependence on the outside that may work for a while, but we kind of understand that from a food security perspective, it's very troubling, right? But I want to draw your attention to the fact that in modern agriculture, like I was saying earlier, we do depend on importing not just food. Even if we were producing all of our own food in the islands, we would still rely on the importation of these inputs, right? Tractors or whatever it may be, right? Some of that you just aren't ever going to be able to solve, maybe. But there are some things, inputs, that maybe that can change, right? So I want us to think about, to what extent can this change? I mean, it's not necessarily something that we are stuck with the way that it is. There are local alternatives, I suppose. And so what are some of those? So like I said, I'm going to use the agroecological lens or framework to look at this. And for those who don't know that term, agroecology is, broadly speaking, a framework for looking at agriculture holistically, which would mean using the whole food system as your kind of guide. And what is the food system? It's every aspect of how food is produced and consumed, not just the agricultural production. That's what a scientist like me would focus on, because that's where the food comes from, of course. But everything else that we do along the way also has a part to play. And every place has a food system. It's not a question of that. It's just a question of what is the food system. So including, for example, disposal, right? We bring in a lot of stuff, a lot of food, a lot of everything else that we bring in. Once it's here, what can we do with it, right? A lot of times, unfortunately, it just ends up in the landfill, but there's probably a lot of room for that to change, things that can be cycled through the system locally so that you reduce that need for imports, for example. So this is, but more than anything, it's a perspective that can help us look at proposed solutions and try to gain an appreciation for whether we think this will work. Is this appropriate to our situation? Because a lot of solutions that are proposed are really designed for the mainland or for a large country, right? So we need to be critical when we look at this. So one of the things that we could look at, for example, and evaluate is, what about that idea of recycling inputs? How viable is that? It sounds like a great idea. It probably is. But there are probably reasons why it doesn't happen as much as it does. you need infrastructure for that too, a composting facility, land to do it on, energy probably, on and on. So we have to think about those things holistically, right? Another one is this idea of appropriate technology. This is an idea that gets used in agroecology. And this is a term that I think we would do well to think about more. I teach about this in my class. Technology is good, and we're going to need more technology to kind of close the gap. This is, I think, something we all agree on. But not just any technology. It needs to be the right kind of technology, or applied or adapted in the appropriate way for our context. Like I said, the reality is that most of our farms are small on the global level. So we need to understand that and not kind of pretend that we have these large farms that we don't really have and probably never will, right? So one example would be mechanization is very helpful if you don't have a lot of labor, but not just any mechanization, right? They're very expensive, they break down. What about something smaller, more usable by one person, right? And then I am a researcher, so this one is close to me. I feel the need to say this. For agricultural scientists who work in this region, and experts and policymakers, it's very important that our research questions take into account the current day reality of agricultural production here. So I mentioned before that the inputs are hard to get, and people have a tendency to sometimes forego them when they can or when they have to. We shouldn't just look at that and say, well, that's suboptimal and that's against our recommendations. It may be, but we have to actually recognize the fact of that and craft our experiments to help address the real situation that farmers find themselves in. So I look at water a lot, and we have a lot less rain than you all have, unfortunately. So irrigation is a problem. Dry season is brutal. And a lot of agriculture doesn't happen in dry season just because water is not available. We need to think about that more. You know, maybe there are crops we could be recommending rather than just saying, well, we would recommend that you irrigate your crops. Well, yes, of course we would, but what if they don't have access to the water, for example? And so on. Other questions like, for example, some of the comments earlier today about looking at some of the other plants that we have available and how can they actually be used, or maybe appreciating the fact that they are used by farmers in ways that are maybe a little bit off the books. For example, just allowing the bush around the farm to grow up and act as like a conservation buffer. This is a real live use that people use, but you don't see it reflected in the scientific literature as much. So this is a responsibility for the researchers to take this into account. So that, I believe, does it. I think I nailed it on the time.
Thank you for your presentation. We will now have a session of questions. I have a question here.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. A lot is going on in agroecology in Puerto Rico, and it's been growing steadily, but still we don't see any studies as to the economics in big scale.
Right.
Do you have any information on that, how that could be possible for real? And the second issue that we're having is that the agroecological produce is really expensive. So that also talks about access to food. Not everybody can pay, $10 for a head of lettuce.
Exactly.
So I just wanted to see how you are dealing with these two other issues that come across a lot in conversations about the future of agroecology and its real impact on food security.
Yes, both great questions. I think when it comes to the lack of research that we see, it kind of gets to my last point that studying it is harder because it is more complex by definition. So scientists would naturally shy away from it. And it's also smaller, it's less important. So both those things mean that the research is limited, but we have a responsibility to be more focused with it, including all aspects, including the economics, right? I'm not an agricultural economist, but there are agricultural economists, and that is I would say from a food security perspective, just as important if you look at the food system as production, right? So when it comes to the price of the food, that's an interesting point because it sounds like what you're talking about is food that kind of has a label on it that it was produced with agroecology or something to that effect. And that is one way that that term is used. But what I teach about, I guess, in my course is that this is also a term that can be just thought of as a perspective. It's not necessarily true that there is agroecological agriculture and then everything else. Really, you can use it as just a way of analyzing any agriculture that as it really is, and use that to kind of figure out what's going on. Now, as to the price, that is a very real thing. I would say for myself, somebody who doesn't, I guess, make that much money, I don't really buy that much of the local produce either because it is expensive or hard to get. It's not as convenient, right? Those are very real issues, and I think that is where, when it comes to research, that's where the solution should be focused, I think. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at when I say the research questions should be more appropriate, because I think a lot of what I see from agricultural research in the Caribbean, it's just let's expand or improve production. And that's, of course, welcome in this context. But at the same time, if it continues to be more expensive like that, that doesn't really help in terms of the thing we really care about, which is getting that into the population for food supply. So I would say, from my perspective, I'm a researcher, so it's something that needs to be incorporated more seriously into our research, especially in the Caribbean.
Any other question?
Well, I would say a comment.
Okay.
I do believe that there is a lot to be done in terms, in Puerto Rico it's happening also in terms of, like, for example, I grow my own vegetables, like, for 20 years, and I use agroecological practices. So I believe there is an opportunity in terms of the broader food security issue on promoting that more people grow their own or part of their own food.
Yes.
And I think that's a great opportunity, that we connect more people to growing their own food, and that contributes to the bigger situation of food security, or insecurity.
Absolutely.
So is that happening in the Virgin Islands, that more people are taking interest in growing something? Yeah,
I think so, and I think that's kind of when I was talking about our strengths. I think that's one of them in the Caribbean, is that's something that is still familiar to people, or that people are still interested in. You get other places in the States, the distance between them and that is so vast that they're not even seriously considering that they themselves could grow their own food. But we're blessed with things like a breadfruit tree that could simply be in your yard, and that's food production right there. So, and that would be, again, to the research point, or just the broader, higher level perspective. I think that also should be taken more seriously. Again, it's small. It may not even be a farm. It's your backyard, as someone said. But that is, I think, probably the key to success in this region, because it always has been in reality. So, yeah, I would agree. Of course, we're trying in the Virgin Islands to promote that too. We have this agriculture fair every year. This is our heritage, really. The truth is, a lot of it's not agricultural related anymore. Yeah, but if you come to the UVI tent, it will be. So please visit if you like. But that's what we are doing there, really, is reaching out to the community, non-farmers, and saying, look, we give out seedlings. You could plant a tree. Here's what you can learn about producing food. You don't have to consider yourself as doing agriculture necessarily to produce food. So.
Hi, my name is Johnny, and I work for the Hawaii Agriculture Research Center. In Hawaii, we have the same issues that we have here in Puerto Rico and that you have there. One of the concerns that we have understood how we have to link our work with social scientists and education, right? Like that is a component. But as you were mentioning, a lot of the agroecological farmers or producers are not, or are usually not as receptive to biotechnology, especially for seed production. Yeah. So how do you see that integration of biotechnology to make better use of, for example, water issues?
I think that, from just my opinion, I guess, on the matter is, for me, it is about this. I really focus on this idea of the appropriate technologies, by which I mean I will take anything as long as it is appropriate. For me, when I use the term agroecology, as I was saying, I think of that more as just a framework or a way of analyzing something like a biotechnological approach. In many ways, that's very attractive because the inputs are kind of already baked into the genetics, and so that's something that can potentially be locally, sustainable. Those are the kinds of, I guess, ways of analyzing it that I would be interested in. Whereas, some of the technologies that are maybe less appropriate are ones that rely on a continuous importation of inputs and maintenance and all these things. Those are the ones that I find myself more skeptical of because, frankly, we see them tried and they tend to fail or whatever. So I guess my way of approaching that would be don't just discredit some new technology immediately just because of where, what its associations might be. Think, can that be used in the real life context of island farming? And if it can, let's give it a shot. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hensley, for your presentation. Now we will have a lunch break at the cafeteria, sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science Caribbean Division. Please, the ticket that was given to you at the registration table, give it to the staff of the cafeteria so they can give you the lunch. We'll meet back at 1:25 p.m. to continue with the symposium.